Is it clear what I'm saying about that? It's, again, if you can't militarize your own land, that applies to the Spratlys as well. So this is something we need to pay attention to. The same logic applies.
And he said is in accordance with international law.
Right.
That was part of
Because it's part of a sovereign nation's right of self-defense. China has indisputable sovereignty from these islands. Therefore, you can load up the Spratlys with anything, and this by definition cannot constitute militarization and therefore doesn't violate what Xi Jinping said. Now that's a lot of hoops to jump through in one sentence, right? But that's the position if you put these pieces together.
What about the Philippines?
What about the Philippines?
Spratly.
Yes, the Philippines also claims the Spratlys. Yes, but you're missing the fact that China's right and the Philippines are wrong. You see? So you're simply in error. But this is really the position. It's indisputable sovereignty based on historical rights. This has always been an indisputable part of Chinese territory.
But the Chinese claims really start with the 9-dash line. Isn't that really, you know?
Which is why I began with that.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's based on the logic of the 9-dash line, which they have been trying to build a case based on what they call historical rights. And the argument is that if you can prove that China has always had sovereignty over the Spratlys, which is going to be tough because China didn't always have the idea of sovereignty. That's a Western idea. But if you can prove that, then China's rights to the Spratlys are both historically and therefore legally prior to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is the kind of case that they wish to make. We will get a look, an interesting sounding, yes sir?
Yeah, I'm Don. Yeah, I'm just studying the ancient Chinese history. It looks like an old Chinese crook.
Yes.
What I mean is,
Yes.
Philippines, Vietnam, that's part of our land. Trying to turn around and say, show me the data. Show me the character. We
Right.
have written character many years ago. Show me. They don't have their interpretation Chinese character been around a long time. Yadong is one example. It is from Beijing area. Keep moving down. They're old trees. So I think that's the key we have to fight against the claim.
Well,
Thank you, Don.
and it's, yeah, I mean, this stuff is highly equivocal, right? And it's ultimately undemonstrable. And when you read these same arguments about the legal history and other sorts of histories of the Diaoyu Senkakus, it's equally confused. I think the most important point is that these issues are going to be solved, if they can be solved, through politics and force projection moving forward and not by historical legal argument, in my view. So it's not that these aren't without interest, but this is not going to be it's not going to be one on legal or historical argument. It's going to be one moving forward. And then in May, you will see the Court of Permanent Arbitration at The Hague is going to rule on the Philippines lawsuit. And so we will have a ruling in all likelihood on whether the 9-dash line has any status. Any status that any country is bound to respect under international law. We don't know where that case will go, but it may well go very much against China. It may be that The Hague says that this is without meaning under international law. China is not a party to the suit. It will not recognize that finding, but it will certainly knock out, a leg or two from the Chinese, at least in terms of their ability to project the moral high ground going forward. But it's not going to be determinative by any means, and there's no enforcement power in The Hague. So, in sum, on the Chinese point of view, China, if we look at the Diaoyus, if we look at the Spratlys over the past 6 years, at all of their behavior, the Paracels, the Spratlys, China has been pretty consistent. I think it's a pretty clear read. This pattern of salami slicing, escalation, building, equipping, preferably when there's a provocation, and I think it's fairly reasonable to project that kind of behavior forward. It's consistent with China's own professed goals. I think that we should therefore expect to see a continuation of the expansion and equipment of the Paracels, including military. The same thing in the Spratlys. We should expect to see more expansion and equipping of the Spratlys, including military equipping. And at some point when it's most plausible internationally, I still expect China to declare an air defense identification zone at some point within the region. So we have to be preparing for that. So that's sort of the China side. albeit from an American point of view. What about the US position? China professes to be baffled that we're interested at all. This is so far from you. You know, why do you care? What's the issue? You know, why are you doing all this on our doorstep? The American position, we take no position on territorial questions. Which island, which rock should belong to whom, we are not a claimant. We do say that these issues should be solved by all claimants according to international law and without coercion. And then most importantly, from China's point of view, and I think from our own as well, we say that the United States will fly and sail anywhere that international law allows. In other words, we are going to continue to be the upholder of the idea of the global commons. And this is one of the things that's really at stake in the South China Sea, which is bedrock for international law. The American belief, again, China has its virtue narrative. We, of course, have a virtue narrative as well. It is the United States as the primary guarantor of security in the region that has provided the peace, the Pax Americana, that has allowed all of the regional nations to not engage in an arms race and instead focus on economic development, including China. China is as the greatest economic developer, is the primary beneficiary of this. And this was something that America provided, in no small part, out of its own pocket. We also make the point repeatedly to China that our position in the South China Sea is intending to honor our obligations to our treaty allies, which is absolutely essential to our own security as well as to theirs. And that we make the point that without the United States as a primary guarantor of peace, there would be an arms race, including a nuclear arms race, certainly in Northeast Asia, which is not in China's interests. We also defend our actions in the region in terms of the United States' broad interests, not just military interests, but its economic and other interests. And this is the idea of the rebalance to China, a recognition that because of the vitality of the area and the energy, the economic forces, the population, this is where America's primary interests are, and therefore we need to rebalance not only our military, but also our diplomatic and economic efforts there as well. China's response is that this is a thinly veiled effort to encircle and contain China, and this is all about China. And they don't believe, now here again, we're on a slightly shaky ground. Americans are regularly told, oh, no, this has nothing to do with China. They don't buy it. Why should they? I think the best way to put it is that China's rise was the primary factor that compelled America to realize that its interests were more in the Pacific than in Europe. Maybe a better way to put it. This line that we simply have with China is, no, you need to understand this really has nothing to do with you, I think is disingenuous and really undercuts us. I think we should call it as it is and say, yes, this is a major factor, but not the only factor, in my view. So I think that those American principles, there's not too much question about, but there are questions about our strategy, our capability, and our will in the area. I heard some of the previous speakers mentioned that the US 2017, the proposed defense budget, focuses on China. Secretary Carter has said we are seeing the return of great power competition in Europe with Russia, and then secondly, and this is quoting, in the Asia Pacific, where China is rising and where we're continuing our rebalance to maintain the stability in the region that we've underwritten for the past 70 years. There's the virtue narrative, which I also feel is a historical fact, but the Chinese feel theirs is as well. And it's allowed so many nations to rise, prosper, and win. This is Secretary Carter. So we're seeing now a call for a more active United States military in the region. One of the most active proponents of this is Congressman Randy Forbes of Virginia, who's the head of the Congressional China Caucus, and also the chairman of the Sea Power Subcommittee. And he's been calling regularly for sustaining our undersea warfare advantage, which the new budget, I think, calls for 9 new Virginia-class subs, extending the range and capabilities of our carrier air wings. We're actually proposing to cut one, and he's also called for a lot more carrier-launched drones, heavy use of drones, keeping a long-range bomber on track, more deep penetration bombers. This, I think, is a big question. With more deep penetration bombers, meaning bombers that can go way into the Chinese hinterland, what kinds of actions are we therein envisioning when we call for this? I think we need to ask ourselves that. He also calls for preserving access to the space domain, improving our munitions, our force structure, which is a big issue, and investing in more cutting-edge and next-generation technologies. In other words, Congressman Forbes and a great many others saying, to meet our goals in the South Pacific, we need to spend more. We need to raise the costs. We also need to raise the risk, as Senator McCain has repeatedly made clear. He said the US should consider additional options to raise the costs on Beijing's behavior. Conducting occasional freedom of navigation operations are inadequate. We should adopt, this is quoting McCain, policies with a level of risk that we have been unwilling to consider up to this point. So we have to incur more risk and we have to incur greater costs. That's the position we're in now. I'd like to close just with a few suggestions, none of them earth-shattering, none of them that solve the problem. Again, this is called There Is No End in Sight. But a few principles that I hope might be part of the mix as we try to, if not solve, at least manage the area, manage better the issues in the South China Sea. And just for the record, I actually agree with Senator McCain. The argument for doing freedom of navigation cruises is an argument for doing them fairly regularly. Not as just an occasional, semi-annual reminder. I don't think that that's going to cut it. So I'm glad that he frankly says that this means a higher level of risk if we're serious. We need to look at that. Yeah. So number one, I think that with growing competition with China, shy of conflict, I think that we've always had a competitive, cooperative relationship, and that we've tried to put a thumb on the cooperative side of the scale. It's getting harder and harder to do for a lot of reasons. We're tilting toward the competitive, and I think that that's going to be true whether the next president is Democrat or Republican. But I think that we still need to keep engagement with China as one of the pillars of our China policy. Far from sufficient on its own, but it needs to be a part of it, and engagement is a recognition that, one, we need to play for time, and two, that China is changing. And we don't know where China's changes are taking it, and even China doesn't know. I forget who said, and the person deserves to be quoted, and I've tried to find it and I couldn't, but that in this interplay of competition and cooperation, China is betting that it will get powerful before it changes, and we are betting that China will change before it gets too powerful. When we look at that, was it Mike? You sure?
He may have stolen some.
Yeah, Mike may have still, I'll ask him.
Spirit?
I'm not sure, but anyway, it's a good line. But maybe it was Mike, I'm not sure. I think there's something else when we think of China changing, and it's very important to realize that China is not a monolith. It's not moving inexorably in one direction. It's looking more like that recently. But in fact, it's the direction and type of its change is not yet determined. But there is something that I think we can be fairly sure of now. And I wouldn't have said this 6 months ago. Unless there is a major cataclysm in China, I think that the nature of Xi Jinping's governance is not likely to change until at least about 2027. Until about 2027. So a long way out. Why? Xi Jinping actually goes out of power in 2022. Chinese Communist Party General Secretaries generally serve 2 consecutive 5-year terms. But Xi's leadership is different than those of his 2 immediate predecessors, actually 3 immediate predecessors. He's been very much about as nearly total as possible control, not only over policy and the economy, but also over culture and education, the media. And now we see, in addition to something that comes close to a burgeoning cult of personality, a new claim that Xi Jinping is the core. He's the core. We need to protect the core. This is big stuff, and we've got to look at it. Okay, none of his predecessors had this announcement. This is very much related to the anti-corruption campaign in which he's purging the patronage networks that were put in place by his 2 predecessors, and he's putting in his own people and accruing more power to himself. When his second 5-year term ends in 2022, will he cease to be the core, and will that mantle go to the next guy? Absolutely not. There's no precedent for that. One of 2 things happens. He hands over the titles, as Deng did, and remains absolutely the core leader, sans title. This is the Deng model, in which case he's still calling the shots at least till 2027, if not beyond. Or, were he to truly pull back entirely, which is getting harder and harder to imagine, his predecessor would have to spend the first 5 years of his governance sweeping out the Xi Jinping patronage network and doing very little while he put his own folks in. I'm sorry, successor. So I think that we need to assume that the Xi Jinping strategic dispositions remain the operative dispositions until about 2027. That's the assumption of policy. I think too that the United States, and I mean, some of my colleagues, you might have a better sense than I do of whether this has happened. I know about the RAND study and some others. It's not clear to me, tell me if I'm wrong, have we done a really serious, skeptical self-audit of our ability to do what we have to do to maintain unquestioned dominance in the area in light of China's rise and military capabilities? It seems to me we have not. Again, they have enormous advantage in proximity, which I've read about. They are closing the gap on capabilities, and I believe they have an enormous advantage of will. China prefers to achieve its goals gradually and through peaceful means. But I do not doubt that if they felt they had to, they would be willing to go another way. And per McCain's comment, what are we capable of doing, especially in light of our own domestic budgetary problems, and what are we really willing to do in terms of sacrifice? You know, I've got a 14, 16-year-old son. Am I going to send them to war to defend the global commons in the Western Pacific? I'm thinking that's a little abstract for most Americans. We talk about life and death. I'm not sure we've done the serious self-audit and know that we can put behind our words and our intentions and our strategies the kinds of force that we say we can. And the Chinese will do this audit on us from their side. This is why I say they've taken our measure on the salami slicing. They seem to see this more clearly than we do. I'm not sure we've done a serious self-audit. It's very important. I think we need to, and we're doing this, encourage other claimants beside the Philippines to take the international arbitration route, Vietnam and others, and we should encourage China to do this. We should do it ourselves in a perfectly neutral way. They may not always win. There may be findings in China's that work for China sometimes, but we should encourage that. A question, and again, we've got a lot of military experts on the panel, I'm not a military expert. We criticize China a lot for its ambiguity